Hello, everyone, and welcome to Climate Change and Resiliency in Fairfield. Today is Tuesday, March 23rd, 2021. My name is Philip Barr. I am Head of Adult Services here at Fairfield Public Library in Fairfield, Connecticut. Before we get started, I'd just like to take a quick thank you. I want to do a shout out to the Shoe Theater and Bill Harris, who were initially supposed to be helping us, partnering with us to host the film screening portion of that, but that, because of COVID, has continued to be all done virtually. So I'm looking forward to many partnerships with the Shoe Theater in the near future. Also, any of you that are using the chat during the panel, that would be preferred, and then we will ask you to unmute after the panel is over to ask questions. So Fairfield Public Library has been awarded a Resilient Communities grant from the American Library Association. And as part of that grant, we have invited you to view the Nova film, Decoding the Weather Machine. The film is a large, broad view of the planet and the climate crisis. We are actually using the film as a springboard today, and our panelists will be drilling down to a micro level and discussing how our community is affected by climate changes and specifically flood and erosion through water here in Fairfield, Connecticut. So I would like to introduce the four panelists. Emmeline Harrigan is a certified planner and flood plan manager and currently serves as the assistant planning director in Fairfield, Connecticut. She has a master's degree in urban planning from UCLA. She previously served as Milford's assistant city planner and assisted in disaster recovery and residency planning after both Storm Irene and Storm Sandy. Dick Mahusky is the current secretary of Fairfield's Flood and Erosion Control Board. He's a graduate of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy and a registered professional engineer. His career concentrated on construction, operations, and maintenance of large industrial facilities. Now retired, his family has lived in Fairfield since 1972, currently residing in the beach area. His home was flooded during Storm Sandy, and along with 67 other residents, and with the financial assistance from the HMGP grant program, he subsequently restored and elevated it to FEMA standards. Post-Sandy, he has learned of the FECB and was appointed to it by the Board of Selectmen in 2013. Laura Pulley is the Assistant Town Engineering Manager with the Town of Fairfield, where she has served for over 35 years with the town. She graduated from the University of Connecticut with a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering. Laura is a strong advocate of green infrastructure and promotes and encourages the use of GI technology on all redevelopment projects in the town of Fairfield. She is also concerned with the effects of climate change and the impacts it has on Fairfield. Laura has worked closely with the Flood and Erosion Control Board, promoting many of the board's recommended municipal projects, all geared towards mitigating the effects of flooding and erosion. And finally, Becky Bunnell is a Fairfield resident for over 11 years, current chair of the town's Flood and Erosion Control Board, whose role it is to work with the town staff to plan, construct, reconstruct, and manage the town's flood and erosion control system, which includes dikes, berms, dams, piping, jetties, seawalls, embankments, tide gates, revetments, water storage areas, ditches, drains, and any other structures or facilities that prevent damage from flood or erosion caused by seawater or fresh water. Becky is also a member of the Sustainable Fairfield Task Force and chair of the Subcommittee on Food and Waste, and a member of the Fairfield Beach Residents Association. We will now go into the program itself. The first part of Emmeline's presentation, the first minute or so, was cut off, so you'll see a jump right into that. Thank you.
We are actually reliant a bit on Yukon to help us with some of the modeling that's occurring to Fairfield and the entire state of Connecticut. But one of the things that they've been able to do for us is, there are a lot of national projections that are being done to determine how sea level rise impacts will face the nation. What Yukon and the associated academics and state representatives have done through the Connecticut Institute for Resiliency and Climate Adaptation, which is also known as CIRCA, what they've been able to do is really kind of drill down to Connecticut's localized conditions and do some sea level projections for us here locally. So what they are talking about and what they envision seeing is 20 inches of sea level rise by the year 2050, which really is not that far off. They are kind of, when they look at what that projection is based on, they're looking at actual tide gauge data. They're extrapolating that out in conjunction with some of the projections that we're also getting, again, from the national climate analysts. So what we also know is, that's kind of considered our immediate range sea level rise impact, but we also can expect to see much higher sea level rise impact by the year 2100. Some estimates are as high as 3 to 7 feet of sea level rise. Of course, in Connecticut, we're experiencing two things. We are experiencing Long Island Sound as increasingly getting warmer, which when that happens, of course, the water body expands and it gets higher. But we're also experiencing the state of Connecticut is actually also, as a result of glacial rebound, is also sinking a bit. So there's two things that are happening that are a bit of a disadvantage to Connecticut. So what does sea level rise mean? I actually borrowed this, this graphic. I'm just going to make it a tiny bit smaller. I borrowed this graphic from a presentation that Juliana Barrett, who is one of the professors who is part of the CIRCA team at Yukon, that she provided to us in a presentation about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago now, I think. And I think it really kind of helps in a graphic way explain why we really need to be concerned about sea level rise. We have our regular high tides that we're affected by, but when you throw sea level rise into that, of course, what it means is that that high tide gets higher. For us here, we can expect a fairly regular storm surge impact because we have big storms. So when we look back at the history of both the state of Connecticut and us here locally in Fairfield, we are affected by fairly large storms about every 8 to 10 years. We had a fairly significant gap before Irene and Sandy of, I think, about 15 to 18 years. But before that, when you look at our cyclical large storm event weather patterns, it's really about every 10 to 12 years where we get these large storms that either FEMA can categorize as a 100-year storm based on rainfall conditions, or that have some sort of heavy onshore surge impacts based upon, wind-driven tidal impacts. So for us, that really means that we have to look at what's happening, not just in terms of sunny day flooding events, i.e. our high tides get higher on a daily basis, but also what that means in terms of how far inland, and you can see that in the lowest most cross section, how far inland that storm surge tends to get pushed in when we now end up with these fairly cyclical heavy storm events when that high tide is generally higher. The other thing that's happening, of course, is that sea level rise is a global phenomenon. So global sea level rise rose about 8 inches from 1880 to 2009. In the last decade, that's occurred at a much more significant statistical rate. And they know that because they check the tide gauges and they're able to measure it in that way. But the concern is, of course, that once things start to warm, that warming happens more rapidly, and the effects are much quicker than slower warming circumstances. One of the reasons why we're experiencing sea level rise is not just what's happening to the water, but how the air affects everything. So when you get higher air temperature, and they're kind of seeing this statistically over time in the Northeast, not only is that warmer water body feeding some of the atmospheric conditions, but that warmer air temperature can hold more precipitation until it can't. And so we're seeing that not just in the big storms, but we're seeing it in what's more commonly referred to as kind of the rain bomb storms, where once the air is really, really warm, you know, it just sucks up that moisture, and then it just drops it all at once. So instead of, you know, a 2-inch rainstorm over 12 hours, we end up with a 2-inch rainstorm in an hour, which our storm drain systems are not really designed to accommodate. So that's one of the other issues that we experience. The other thing that is happening nationally, and this is not just here in Fairfield, but we wanted to provide this example of kind of the man-made impacts of why we experience major storm impact, is because there's been so much increased development. My husband sent me a link earlier this morning that there was a recent book that was just put out that is called Katrina, and it has a time frame from 1915 onward. Because when you look at what happened with Hurricane Katrina and you look at the storms that have heavy impact around the nation, it's because we've increased development in areas where we know that these are natural storm detention areas. So I just wanted to show in this map, this is generally the same area, but in 1934, most of the Fairfield Beach area was largely undeveloped, and it was a tidal basin. So that was where the place, that was the place where, by natural design, water was intended to go. In the post-war housing boom, post-World War II housing boom, you start to see a lot more development in these areas where, again, by natural design, water's intended to go. And then, of course, in the map that you can see from 2016, we have, you know, the conditions that we largely see today. And so I just provided an inset there that shows kind of the depth of the flooding. And the fact that, you know, I think what most people saw and experienced was that this was a place where the water went and it just didn't leave, because it is by natural design a basin intended to do that. But unfortunately, when you put development in nature's way, nature doesn't change its behavior. It does what it's meant to do. So, you know, I think we have to decide moving forward, you know, how do we address these things? So, of course, in Fairfield, you know, I think a lot of people saw the storm impacts, both in terms of some of the wave impact, the properties that were most impacted by wave impacts that you could see at the bottom, where that movement of water was very forceful and unfortunately ended up, you know, really severely damaging some structures. And then just, you know, even some of the ambient kind of bathtub scenario that you saw in Fairfield, where, you know, you had a lot of very deep flooding. As mentioned before, you know, we are seeing nationally this increased percentage of precipitation, and we see that most greatly in the New England states. So we've had a 71% increase in heavy precipitation events. And I think Laura is going to speak to that later in terms of what we're seeing in terms of our roadways. But, you know, snapshot, spoiler alert, our stormwater systems weren't prepared for the kind of storms that we're seeing today and the kind of heavy precipitation that I think meteorologists believe is going to become more regular based on warmer water temperatures, as well as higher air temperatures ambiently. So we did have a very heavy rainfall event back in September 2018. There was about 4.5 inches of rain within a 4-hour period. And because water tends to roll downhill, and we're at the bottom of the hill here is a direct Long Island Sound adjacent community, we not only received the rainfall that we had here in Fairfield, but we got Trumbull's rainfall, and we got, you know, other communities' rainfall that just kind of rolled downhill down to us here at Fairfield, where it then empties into Long Island Sound. So if you can recall that September 2018 storm, it was quite a significant event for Fairfield. In terms of major storm impact in Fairfield, again, we see the drainage infrastructure that has a hard time dealing with larger rainfall events, even in our downtown area where you don't have a direct adjacent water body. But again, that stormwater system's just not prepared to deal with what we're experiencing today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dick now. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And again, we're going to answer those at the end.
Okay, thank you, Emmeline. I think I unmuted myself. Hope you can hear me. So I've been on the Flood and Erosion Control Board since 2013, right after Sandy. Sandy was my wake-up call to what might happen here in Fairfield. By 2015, we had the Flood and Erosion Control Board. We had put together a master plan of what we might do to mitigate the effects of flooding in Fairfield. The genesis of this plan was after Sandy, which was in October 2012. After that, the Public Works Director got together with Race Engineering, who was a local coastal engineering firm, and they took a look at Fairfield and said, okay, what can we do to mitigate the effects of the next one? And they came up with a plan that basically runs along our entire coastline. It's not perfect. It's not a complete wall that's 20 feet high from point A to point B. The intent was to reduce the flooding effects. The wind effects, on a grand scale, you can't do much about wind. Was that me, Emmeline, or? Okay.
I didn't know if you want me to, do you want me to go to the next slide, or you're still
on? No, I'm going to try and say next slide.
Okay, thank you.
And you all have to forgive me for rambling, because it's like one thought leads to another, and it's all surrounding the same topic, but perhaps not on topic. This slide shows our coastal plain for Fairfield. Basically, it goes from the marina, which is at the mouth of Ash Creek, and it is interrupted significantly by Sasko Hill, which is the white thing you see to a little to the left of the center. And then to the left of Sasko Hill is Southport, and Southport rises pretty quickly from the water, so it's not as significantly exposed to the effects of flooding as this, what I'm calling the Central Basin is. And that is the area in yellow at the center of the screen. Now that's the area that in Emmeline's slides was shown not terribly built up pre-World War II, but after World War II, they started building the houses there and building it up. Yellow indicates the area that would be flooded in a Cat 1 storm. The orange takes us up to Cat 2, where there's more wind and hence more water, more storm surge height. The blue is Cat 3, and then the purple is, oh my God, Cat 4. Cat 4 is just a catastrophic storm. Next slide, please. So this is another view of the same area, and you can see the little light colored blue-gray areas. Those are our marshes. And all of the little blue triangles, those are locations of our tide gates. The tide gates are significant in that they are one of our existing man-made lines of defense against flooding beyond the beach. The other man-made defense are the two. One is the berms that are built up on Jennings Beach, and there's also a berm built up on the east side of Penfield Beach, which is termed Rickards Beach. So those berms were done, I'm gonna say 1970, mid 70s, don't hold me to that, but they were done by the Army Corps of Engineers. Also by the Army Corps of Engineers over in South Pine Creek Road area, there was a dike built around the residential area of South Pine Creek Road, and that dike runs all the way around, crosses the marsh where there is a tide gate, and then ends up at the higher elevation landfill, the old landfill. One comment about the tide gates, there are two types of tide gates. One is just a simple flap gate. So when the water behind the flap gate, like a rainstorm, is higher than where it's going, Long Island Sound, then the flap gate simply opens and lets that water out. When the tide comes in and Long Island Sound gets higher than the inland area, that flapper closes and keeps the tide from going across it to the inland areas. The other type of gate is a self-regulating tide gate. And this is important because that's what keeps our marshes healthy. Self-regulating tide gate opens as the tide comes in, but at a certain level that is adjustable, it closes. Now that level is selected to keep the marshes healthy, but to stop the increase of water in the marshes at a certain point. Next slide. I'm gonna try not to keep flapping my mouth here because we have limited time. This is one thing I just wanted to bring out, and this shows a typical cross section down in the beach area. On the left-hand side, you can see Fairfield Beach Road. So that's typically Fairfield Beach Road. There are a number of houses on the Long Island Sound side of Fairfield Beach Road. And I'm showing here the typical slab is at an elevation of 10 feet. And then to the right of that, we typically have a little frontal dune that has been built up of sand, and then beyond that, Long Island Sound. The difference that I want to point out is the difference between height and elevation. So for instance, if I'm standing in the garage, let's say, of that house that's shown there, my feet are at an elevation of 10 feet above some reference point. And the height of where my feet are, as I look around me at the ground, the height is like 0. It's not elevated at all. So many times when we're talking about flood protection levels, we'll talk about, well, that wall is going to be at an elevation of 13 feet. And without knowing better, someone would logically say, oh my God, a wall 13 feet higher than where my feet are standing. That's unacceptable to me. But if you consider, like in this case, Fairfield Beach Road is shown at like 6.5 feet, if I can see that. So if the roadway is 6.5 feet and I want to provide protection to an elevation of 13 feet, I only have to go 7 feet higher. And that 7-foot high wall from the ground will give me protection up to an elevation of 13 feet. This slide also shows some relative elevations of Sherman School, Old Burying Ground, Sullivan Hall, the Old Town Hall. So you can see from the level of Sandy was 9.2 feet, the still water level of Sandy over on the right-hand side. So 9.2 feet, Sherman School is only 0.8 of a foot higher than the still water of Sandy. So that's why when Sandy came and flooded the basin, Sherman School was surrounded by water. It didn't get up to their slab elevation, but it was surrounded by water. Next slide. So the Army Corps of Engineers, they did a study in 2019. As I said, they built the dike system down at South Pine Creek and the dunes on Jennings Beach. So in 2019, under a grant that Jim Himes got for Connecticut, that was able to fund a study of Fairfield as to what can Fairfield do to mitigate the effects of the next hurricane. You can see the study area there, again, from Ash Creek up to the foot of Sasko Hill on the left-hand side. Next slide. So what their study did, it explored 5 different options. The recommended option cost was $546 million. So this stuff does not come cheap. The cost benefit was positive in that the damage avoidance was more than the cost to do it. But how the Army Corps works is they have to go to their bosses in Washington and say, okay, we have this project for Fairfield, and they rank that along with every other project in the country. And the hurdle for projects that might get approved are a much higher cost benefit ratio than 1.7. So we didn't have much of a chance. The other thing that happens federally is that the Army Corps is not given inexhaustible money to do all these wonderful things in California, in Florida, on the Gulf Coast, in the Northeast, in Norfolk. So we just are not going to do all of the projects that we can identify in this country. The other thing is that for this project, it would have to have a local match to the federal funds. And in this case, the match for Fairfield was going to be, I believe it was $190 million. And at the time we said, no, there's no way that's going to happen, that we can find $190 million in our residents' pocketbooks to spend. Next slide. I get one, just to go back on that. The interesting thing is that through all of the ensuing years after Sandy, that original scheme that was put together by Public Works and Race, providing a combination of walls and built up dunes, that has stood the test of time because the Army Corps solution was pretty much the same. So what's the Flood and Erosion Control Board currently doing? Well, we're just continuing to update our plan. We're evaluating the options for adaptation. We're always learning something. It seems that every year there are a few more seminars and webinars now, but in-person meetings before, hosted by people like CIRCA. CIRCA is the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. They are out of the University of Connecticut, and they have a very close linkage with the DEEP. One of my orientations is that CIRCA is kind of like the research or a research arm of DEEP. So there was a study that CIRCA put out, which keyed into recently, the governor has a governor's climate committee, and they put out a report in January, which is very interesting to look through. So the current thinking is to provide resilient corridors so that we can safely get residents in or out of, primarily out of flood emergencies or warnings of flood emergencies. And it's interesting to note that out on the Fairfield Beach Road Peninsula, there is sunny day flooding today. When we have a high pergy tide, sections of those roadways do flood during the high tide portion. Ways to get the water out quickly when it comes in: South Benson Pump Station, which Laura Pulley will speak to a little bit later. And then to selectively harden the low-lying prone areas to keep water from flooding in the majority of storms. Just as a point of information, the town, not to the tune of $190 million, but the town is putting up some money so we can do some serious significant plans for this in the capital budget that was just approved by the RTM yesterday. There's $100,000 earmarked there for a study along the coast as to what is the right thing to do. Next slide. Is not mine. So with that, thank you. I'll turn it over to Laura Pulley and see you in a bit.
Hi, everybody. Hope you could hear me okay. Dick, you did a great job, and thank you for talking about the U.S. Army Corps of Engineering's project looking at the town of Fairfield. The competition to get any funding from them, we did rise above the regional level, and to compete against the national level, we'd be competing against, in that movie, I thought the movie was great, but they did mention that Norfolk and our naval base is getting the $1.5 billion project to harden that yard, and how long that's going to provide protection is, nobody knows, and what they're designing it to. And I'm going to discuss what we are doing to harden some of our critical, on a smaller micro level, I would say, not the macro level, micro level in town here. But looking at our downtown flooding, we are cognizant it has gotten worse since the downtown has been so highly urbanized. The train station parking lot was constructed in the late 1980s. That contributed to a lot of stormwater runoff. Impervious surfaces don't allow rainwater to penetrate. It runs off, creates flooding. I know we're dealing with climate change. Emmeline did mention the rain bombs that we experience, and this is the result of the rain bombs. Our drainage systems are just as designed, mostly 10 to a 25-year storm. These rain bombs we're seeing, they could be a 100-year storm event. In 2014, our rainfall rates were changed by NOAA, which, to make matters worse, so what used to be a 100-year storm prior to that is now a 50-year storm, or what was a 1% chance of happening yearly is now 2% chance of happening. And
Laura?
they're getting worse. Yeah?
Can you clarify for them, like, what amount of rainfall delineates that storm?
So currently a 50-year storm is around 7.2 inches of rain, and our 100-year storm is 8.4 inches of rain in one day. And prior to the change of the rainfall rates, the 100-year storm was a 7.2 inch. So it's gone up an inch, and the lesser storms, the 2, the 10, the 25, and the 50-year storm also have been notched down as well. So these they're getting worse, and it's nationally known across the entire country. Our drainage system, since we're a coastal community, the major outfalls, if it's not drained into a river or stream, the coastal area drains directly into our tidal marshes, which are controlled by tide gates or just the good old tide. So a lot of these inverts, when it was they were constructed back in the 50s, 60s, and even 70s, were placed either at or below mean sea level. So the mean sea level rate has increased, which means our inverts are even lower than that window of opportunity that allows the stormwater to drain out. So you could see this, the flooding that we are experiencing in downtown and elsewhere in town. You could click forward if you'd like. Oh, go back to that. One of the things, Emmeline, if you just want to reverse back, the photo on the right does show some of the on-site stormwater detention that we installed in the Sherman Green. I forget how many Coltech units, I think it was over 70. Their chambers, it takes some of the rainwater and puts it back into the ground where it would go if there was not any impervious surface. So this seems to be helping the downtown area. In addition to, when you look at this slide, the photo on the right, almost 2 years ago, we put in just under an acre at the downtown train station. This is porous pavement, and this is a rain event right after it rained. It was fresh asphalt, fresh porous pavement. In the background is conventional pavement, which runs down onto the porous pavement. So you could see the difference, how dry the porous pavement is. The rain just goes right through it into a stone reservoir below. So all of that water is getting put back into the ground. We're removing a good chunk of stormwater runoff that would have contributed and been piped through the drainage system, which goes to downtown Fairfield. So since this has happened, we've had some significant rain events. I don't think we've had nearly as many complaints as downtown flooding since this has been installed. So it is helping. I think the parking lot is 7 to 9 acres or so, and the downtown area comprises, I should know off the top of my head, but I don't, but maybe 10%. No, should be, I think it's less than that. Anyway, the rest of the downtown is privately owned. So as each property comes in for redevelopment, the old blends, there's a parcel next door to that. They're required to install detention for a 100-year storm event. So as each property comes in for redevelopment, and they are coming in, that is one of the requirements, and it's helping little by little. It's baby steps, but we're starting to get the water put back into the ground, letting it stay where it should, rather than piping it to Long Island Sound and with all the pollutants. Okay, we can move forward. Riverine flooding is another issue that we have. Rooster River flooding, like Emmeline had said, we did receive a lot of runoff we get it from Trumbull and Bridgeport, urbanized Bridgeport. Trumbull is rural, and the mall is quite a huge site, which is totally paved, and it all comes our way. So we have an agreement with a local consulting engineering firm. They are looking at designing detention systems which will hold the water back. And these are the prioritized locations that we're looking at. The golf course up at Fairchild Wheeler, where London's Brook comes through, Rooster River, Horse Tavern, all feed that. And it's at the upper reaches of the watershed. So if we could retain that water on the golf course and allow all the other water down, below the lower end of the watershed to flow through, and then a good chunk of the water could then come afterwards, so that the peak of the storm is delayed and doesn't coincide with the peak of the rest of the watershed below. Woodfield Village is in the same area. It's a little bit lower in the watershed, as is Melville, Tunxus Hill, Algonquin, and Owenfish. But right now the priority is the Fairchild Wheeler Golf Course. I think that would provide us the most bang for our buck, and we would see some significant improvements in flooding of that riverine, the Rooster River. So what are we doing to protect town of Fairfield? After Sandy, there was a lot of, a lot of damage. The wastewater treatment plant was flooded. Luckily, not terribly. I think it suffered about $50,000 worth of damage, but if the storm continued as it was predicted to, it would have been a catastrophic damages to the treatment plant. So the state of Connecticut, the federal U.S. HUD, along with the state of Connecticut, they issued community development block grant disaster recovery funding opportunities. The town applied for multiple of these grant opportunities, and we did receive money for the hardening of the wastewater treatment plant. So the photos show what the material is that we're using. We're building like a dike around, much like what the Army Corps is going to do to the Naval Yard in Norfolk. They're building steel sheet pile wall around with floodgates, with pumps. We don't have any floodgates per se. What this project does involve is we are installing all that steel sheeting that's on the ground. This is photos taken when the steel arrived. I was very excited that it finally got to the site and the project was starting. Now about 80% of it is installed. So if you do go down there on Richard White Way and you look around the treatment plant, you'll see all that steel installed. Where it does cross the road, that's where we're going to be raising the road with 2 humps, but which will be the height of the wall. The photo on the bottom left is one of the pump stations. We have 2 pump stations to pump the water out. Should we have a rain event coinciding with a coastal tidal surge. In the photo down below, you could just see the outline of where the wall will be. It encompasses the wastewater treatment plant, the new fire training academy, the conservation workshop building, and the animal control facility. So in total, it's about 2,800 feet, just over 2,800 feet long of a flood wall that will protect this facility set to the 500-year flood elevation because it is federal money. And if you go to the next slide, you could see there is a picture of the machine. He's actually not installing the sheeting there. He's doing some ground improvements, but the top elevation of that wall, 500-year storm based on today's 100-year of 13 is 16.25. So that is the top elevation of the wall. When you go down there, that's the reference point, 16.25. That wall varies in height, 6 feet in some places along Pine Creek, it's 10 to 11 foot high. So it's a substantial wall. It's going to protect our most critical facility from flooding and providing an environmental disaster from occurring should it ever have gotten flooded from a coastal event. Okay, so some of the other mitigation projects that we're looking at is the stormwater pump station, which we did also get a CDBG grant to do the study and partially get it designed. That was a $300,000 grant. That is intended to remove about 2 feet of water from the areas from Penfield Road, Old Post Road, South Benson and Fairfield Beach Road, that floodplain in there. And it should remove the water within 1 day. The reason why Penfield West to Reef Road isn't included is because also one of the community development block grants that we received, we improved the culverts where the water flows out to the west. Penfield Road is almost like the ridge line. It divides that floodplain to the east and to the west. So the water that lands to the east of Penfield drains over to the marina. Any water landing to the west side drains out, to Pine Creek. So during Sandy, there was only one 4-foot diameter culvert that drained the area. It became clogged. It was the only outlet for this floodplain. We realized that this was not a good thing, so we increased the number of culverts. We now have 4 culverts that are there. So when we do have a storm, we could have the ability to go in and open them up and let the water out at low tide. And then we can close them when the tide does come back in, but that will also remove the water in just over a day. So that, I don't know if I had mentioned, that was about a $500,000 or so grant that we did receive from the state. And fortunately, we have not had to use it, but I know that it will come in handy. I hope not too soon, but it will be used. So one of the other, the stormwater pump station, wait, don't flip it yet, down at South Benson, we're looking at that. Construction cost is about $26 million in today's dollars. That also includes improving the stormwater drainage system from Penfield Road, because like I said, from Penfield Road over to the marina area, that's one watershed for the pump station. All of the drains need to be upgraded and made deeper so that it could flow by gravity much better than it currently exists. And it's all based on draining out through a tide gate that is dependent on low tide for us to be able to release the storm water out. Okay, and I think that is all of my slides, and I think I turn it over to Becky.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Dick. So I'm going to sort of wrap it up by just talking about what are our plans and how do we plan to pay for these. I mean, what you heard earlier was Emmeline talking about what's going to happen over the next 30 years to even up to 2021 in terms of more intense rain events, higher sea level rise, higher storm surges. You heard Dick talking about Army Corps came in and did a master plan that would have cost us $546 million, of which we would have had to pay $191 million. So there are ways to stop all of this, but realistically, the way we as a town are approaching this is what Laura has been talking about, which is that we're going to try to be really smart about how we spend our town dollars, do the things that are going to make the most difference, and be realistic about what's going to happen over time in terms of sea level rise and storm surges. So the town does have a multi-year capital plan, and we've been working very closely. The Flood and Erosion Control Board has been working very closely with all of the different town bodies to talk about how we fund various parts of that, such as the pump station is in that capital plan. Other things are in that capital plan. But most projects we try to get funded by either grants, various grants, disaster grants, or other kinds of grants, or we have to bond them as a town. And this all costs money. When we get a grant, typically the towns have to pay a share of that. It goes anywhere from 25 up to 35% of the project, which really can run into millions of dollars. So when you think about that, we have to think long-term about what is it, even if we get these grants, which is great because we're getting money from a state or a federal source to help us with our resiliency, how are we going to pay our town share? So if you go to the next slide. So what we're proposing to do is set up a resiliency fund. So there was a public act that was put into law in 2019 that was called Public Act 19-77 that authorizes municipalities to set up these climate change and coastal resiliency reserve funds, which is great because that basically allows you to save now for what you know are going to be these future risks that are going to be costly to us, and it gives us the 25 to 35% of our matching grant funds that we need. We can save very slowly for it now, as opposed to trying to have to come up with it all at once at that point. There are several other bills that right now are before the House or Senate or are being evaluated in committee. There's a raised bill 971, which is an act concerning the state treasurer and climate change and coastal resiliency funds, which basically is saying that if that passes, the state treasurer would help these towns like Fairfield manage their monies. And that's really important because the whole point of a coastal resiliency reserve fund is it allows you to set up a fund where you can have your money grow at a much higher rate of return than a typical town fund can. So for example, I don't know if you know, our typical town funds are invested at a very conservative rate. Our town pension funds, however, are allowed to invest at a much higher rate of return. They can have a certain percent of stocks, for example. So you actually can get a higher growth rate for your money. And this would allow this coastal reserve resiliency fund would allow us to invest more like a pension fund. So we could get maybe a 5 to 6% rate of return and really grow what is, a small amount of money into quite a bit for when we need it in those 8 to 10 year storms that Emmeline was talking about. The other thing that is in front of committee is HB, House Bill 6441, which is an act concerning climate change adaptation, which allows us to fund these resiliency funds through a buyer's conveyance fee. So this would basically be a fee that if someone wants to come into our town, our lovely town of Fairfield, and buy a house, they would pay up to 1% into this fund. So we would basically be funding our coastal risks by people who want to come live in Fairfield and buy a house. So these are people from outside of Fairfield would come in, and that buyer's conveyance fee would go into this fund, and it would be there for us to use to mitigate future risks. So Brantford right now is the only town that set up this fund. But I think, we would be looking at this as something for Fairfield, which seems to make a lot of sense. It would help us with our share. The other thing that is in HB 6441 is the opportunity for municipalities to set up what is called a stormwater, to upgrade our stormwater drainage systems through what's called a stormwater utility. Up until now, towns have not been able to set them up. If the HB 6441 does pass, well, we could consider that as a way to address what Laura was saying is right now our stormwater system can get overloaded in heavy rain events. And so maybe just, having the ability to have a funding source right now we're slowly going through and improving our stormwater system little bit by little bit every year. And that's the way we've been approaching it. But maybe a stormwater utility might make sense for us down the road as a way to have a funding source for that as well. The other thing I think the town just needs to think about is over a 30 to 50 year period, I think we need to really evaluate any big capital projects that would be in the floodplain. And we might want to consider moving any town critical infrastructure, instead of upgrading. If we're going to do a $15 million upgrade on a school or a senior center, we might want to seriously think about, should that senior center or that school be upgraded in a floodplain, or should we think about moving that to higher ground now, which would mitigate the issue of it being flooded over time. So I think these are all our senior center. I mean, we have right now about 3,000 structures in our town floodplain. We have about 15% of our housing stock. We have, our senior centers there, our fire station, our Sherman School. There's 5 different schools, 3 different churches. I mean, there's most of our historical buildings are in the floodplain. These are all a core part of what we as a town stand for. And I think we need to think very carefully about, do we upgrade them or move them if you're thinking about future sea level risk? The other thing I'd ask us to think about, well, let's go to the next page. But before we do this, I think I want to sort of throw a few numbers out at you in terms of I said there are 3,000 houses in the floodplain. And you look at our town budget that was just put before the RTM, they were asking for about, I think, 317 million in taxes to come out of the grand list. And basically, if it's 15% of our houses are in the floodplain, that's 47 million of taxes in the floodplain. Now, it's probably even higher than that because a lot of the houses in the floodplain actually are more expensive. And so you actually get more taxes. So I've just done a rough cut of the numbers. My guess is it's probably more like 60 to 75 million of our town taxes come from houses in the floodplain. And then if you think about real estate values, And if you think about what's happening right now in Miami, those of you who read the news might have been aware that Miami beachside property is down 14%. So if our town houses in the floodplain, those 3,000 homes that are kicking in right now, let's call it 60 plus million in taxes every year. If those go down 14%, you're going to see somewhere around 8 to 10 million of reduced taxes every single year that you won't be getting as a town. And that's going to have to be made up by the rest of the town residences, unless we figure out some way to not allow our property values to go down, to mitigate the impacts in our town so that we can, plan for these big storms, these bigger rain events, and do it in a way that doesn't reduce property values. So I think you as a resident can do some things yourself if you can afford it. Right now, if you're able to, I'd consider, if you live in the floodplain, raise your house for future flood events. There are low-cost loans that we're exploring through the Green Bank that might allow you to do that. The Governor's Council on Climate Change is looking at options for people who have less means to be able to do that. We need to be able to fund this, not just rich people be able to raise their houses, but we have to be able to mitigate climate change for people who don't have the means to do that. So we need to be looking at all these options so that we could have a fair and equitable way of mitigating climate change for all residents in town. And I think the last thing I'd say is just be prepared for more storms and be ready to evacuate when asked, because right now our fire and our safety and our police are very attuned to keeping us all safe. And if you choose to stay in your house during a major storm event, you're putting themselves at risk, not just, you're putting them at risk, not just yourselves. So I'm going to now stop talking and turn it over to questions. If anyone has a question and would like to unmute themselves, we'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Becky?
Yeah.
Carolyn Camlet, would you be able to run past us the numbers of the measures in the legislature? I got HB 6441, but I think you mentioned 2 other pieces of legislation we might look at.
Yeah, well, the one that has already passed, which passed in 2019, was Public Act 1977. And that was the one that authorized municipalities to set up these coastal resiliency funds. Okay. The 2 that are being reviewed right now, and I believe public comment has happened on both of them. I think they're still in committee, but since the public comment has happened, hopefully they will come out of committee for a vote. The first one was HB 6441, and that had several pieces to it. One piece within that was the ability for municipalities to set up stormwater utilities. We would need to evaluate that as a town to see if that made sense for us, but I think it's nice that we have that option to look at. Another piece of that same bill allowed us to establish the buyer's conveyance fee, and that is actually slightly different. It's not just a straight flat 1%. It depends on the price of the house, but that would allow us to fund something like this coastal resiliency fund, and it would do it by allowing people, I'm sure that some people buy within Fairfield and trade up, in which case that person would have to buy it. But a lot of that money will come from people who want to come live in our wonderful town, who will now pay a buyer's conveyance fee for the privilege of coming to live in our town. So some of that is to be funded from outside. The other bill that I mentioned was it was Raise Bill 971, and that's the act concerning the state treasurer and climate change and coastal resiliency funds. And that would basically, what that's basically doing is proposing that the state treasurer manage these investment parameters along the lines of, that they gave this thing called 7-159D, which I guess is an existing part of the state statute, but it allows them to manage it similar to the way they do the short-term investment funds and things like that, which is good, which is really important because we don't have the resources in our financial community right now in Fairfield, nor does every other community along the coast have resources to all manage our own funds. But if the state treasurer can do it, we benefit from that, and that is something they do with other funds.
Thank you.
Becky, not to put our local representative on the spot, but I see that Representative Leeper is here. If you want to add anything on any of the bills that are pending, we would really appreciate it. Thank you.
You got it. I'm so grateful. This has been so informative. Will you share your presentation after this by any chance? You will. Thank you. So this year is very unusual in the legislature. What a time to be a first-year legislator. Because of the nature of being remote and sort of the bandwidth issues on the nonpartisan staff who really does the bulk of the work behind the scenes, like the legal team and the research team. I'm looking at, is it 6441? That was the governor's proposed bill, and it has, I don't think it even got a public hearing. But what I think happened is it likely got a new number and was rolled into whatever kind of big bill that the Environment Committee put forward. And I have been going back and forth with my colleagues on the Environment Committee, trying to understand, like, what are the big initiatives this year? What is included in your language if you didn't go ahead with the governor's language? And I haven't gotten that yet. And truthfully, these are very, very busy weeks for people. They're wrapping up all of their final public hearings and then their committee votes to decide what's going to go ahead. And then just sort of from a process standpoint, and believe me, I'm also learning this for the first time, they go into screening. And so then all of the legislative leaders kind of decide what will make it from the committee process onto the floor. And I have put in a formal request that every committee shares which bills that will be, because it's hard. I'm unfortunately not on the Environment Committee to keep track of, I think there's something like 15 committees. So all of the priorities in every committee and where they stand in the process. And as soon as I get that information, I can share that with you all, because it's not an easy process to follow. And I'm there. I mean, you know, not physically, but virtually. So I will update everybody as soon as I get that information about what is moving ahead. And here, I just pulled up 6441 again, just to make sure what I told you all was correct. It did get a public hearing on the 8th, but it doesn't look like it was included in any vote. And there's no like JF, which is the joint favorable vote for it to leave committee. So I suspect it's because it got picked up into other bills. And I will share additional information as soon as I get it. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions that people have?
Hi, I have one. It's Sean. Wait, I should unvideo my, or whatever, put myself up. Hi, I just have a question, just because I'm always looking for natural solutions to things. I know that we need technology in a big way, but rain gardens on a massive scale would help a lot of runoff water. And if Fairfield could kind of find its way to on any town properties and encouraging its private landowners to make rain gardens and create rain gardens so that a lot of water would not go into our storm drains during these large storms, that would probably help a lot. No? Yes.
Yeah, I think I can comment on that. We do encourage people to install rain gardens. Yukon Clear's got a great app for rain garden, sizing, siting, construction. I just finished a class that they're going to be issuing for people to get certified in it. I did a trial run for them, and it's very informative. It's very easy, and it gives you exactly what you need to construct a rain garden, and it tells you what types of plants should be installed. But if you look around at different projects, I always encourage green infrastructure. It's so important. We have them at the new arena, at the ice arena. There's going to be one there installed at their entrance at Sacred Heart University. At Sacred Heart University just did the West Campus, the new facade. They had this big area. It was a big circle where they used to have the old GE entrance. They'd go around the circle to the main, the east building. They're going to put a rain garden in there. A lot of homeowners are putting rain gardens in instead of these underground detention structures. Garlic and Herb's got one right in their parking lot as you drive in. On Sherman Street, there's a little tiny rain garden of one of those new office buildings. So I'm always encouraging people in the town, the new golf course, all the runoff from the parking lot, from the new Smith Richardson. We recently renovated it and rebuilt the parking lots, where the runoff goes into either rain gardens or biofiltration swales, which have under drains in them. Rain gardens don't have under drains or overflow structures, but biofiltration swales do, and they're piped eventually to a stormwater drainage system, whereas a rain garden is just pretty much self-contained. So yeah, if, you know, tell your friends and neighbors, they're so easy to construct, and there's a great app that you could look at, and it's so easy. I mean, I was amazed because I had seen the first one. I think Juliana Barrett had put it together, and this one, it actually sizes. You just click on it. It does your measurements for you. The numbers get plugged in. It tells you how big and how deep, everything. It's pretty easy. So I'm
Laura,
all
is that that's the Yukon Rain Garden app, right?
Yukon Clear. Yep, the Rain Garden app.
Okay.
The NEMO website. Yep.
Yep.
It's all updated. It's great. Really
So
good.
this might be something we can
Thank
do
you for
with-
bringing that up. Yeah.
Sean, we might be able to do an outreach program with Sustainable Fairfield on this. I think this is
Yeah.
actually a really
Oh, yeah.
perfect thing
Yeah.
to do.
Well, I've already been thinking pollinator gardens, but all this runoff talk has made me think about rain
because then you could
gardens
do pollinator.
too,
You could do pollinators in the rain around the edges of
so.
some
In the rain gardens, yeah.
pollinator
Yeah.
pathways in Fairfield. I don't know if they're joined the pollinator pathway, but maybe look
They
into
are.
that. I
Yeah.
think they may be on the list. I'm not sure. I know the conservation director had bid a pollinator garden up at I went off of Hoyden's, the open space property up on Hoyden's Hill. So
Yeah. Okay.
all good.
But there's nothing we can do to make town properties that are, say, blank, like alongside highways and along.
Well, those are going to be, believe it or not, they're not going to be underground. They're going to be above ground basins. You know, they may be deep, they may be shallow, but if they're shallow along the edge, there is going to be plantings, especially on the golf course. And there will be, you know, maybe wetland type plants or rain garden type plants that could have wet feed in dry weather. But that's the whole point is to create above ground basins, and on open space town land that we do have, like at the Owen Fish, and Tunxus Hill Park, we have areas there that we could do some retention basins above ground. And they could be planted up, like in an outfield, we can't do, you know, part of the outfield may become part of the detention basin, so we really can't put plants there, but maybe around the perimeter.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you. That was a good suggestion.
Thank you.
If we don't have any other immediate questions, I just wanted to offer that there's always an ongoing opportunity to kind of talk about hazard mitigation on a 5-year basis at the very least, through the update to the regional MetroCog multi-hazard mitigation plan, which we participate in as the town of Fairfield, and that's updated every 5 years. It's required to be updated every 5 years. That update triggers some of the federal funding that we become eligible for, that Laura had mentioned and Becky and Dick had mentioned before. So that is updated really regularly. I would say that in order for it to be adopted every 5 years, that's actually a 3.5-year public outreach cycle in order to meet that 5-year requirement. The other thing that's happening, and we're a bit delayed, I apologize, is we are updating our plan of conservation and development. There is a mandated section that has to discuss sea level rise and its impacts to us locally here in Fairfield. Our hope is to, you know, get back on track with that. I have admittedly, COVID has not slowed down development in Fairfield. If anything, we have been much busier. So just wanted to put that out there in terms of, if this is your interest here locally in Fairfield, there are multiple ways in order to still continue the conversation.
There's not a question, but there is one comment from Jeff. He said, "Thank you all for taking the time to share this information, and that you're doing, and all that you are doing to try to protect the town." So,
This is Dick. I just wanted to comment that there's a natural linkage between what the Flood and Erosion Control Board is trying to accomplish with mitigation and the plan of conservation and development and the strategic plan, because all of these are future looking efforts to see what we're going to be like, to Emmeline's point, 5 years from now, but even out longer than that. I referred to the Circa people, and they did this study where they looked at the various models for sea level rise projections into the future, and they decided to look at like a middle of the road model, and they selected the 2050 number, and that's 20 inches of sea level rise by 2050, or 50 centimeters of sea level rise, which is basically the same number. And that determination caused the state to adopt legislation that says anytime you're using state money for a project that could be impacted by sea level rise, you will plan that project for an additional 20 inches of sea level rise. So that's on our legislated requirements for the horizon. And just another related comment is watching that movie. I think it's a very good movie. You can't argue with what they've come up with. It was a very stringent. No, the scientists are being very serious and very stringent in how they're approaching this. So it's coming. It's just a matter of what is the rate of climate change. And I don't think I'll see a really big impact on it. But I mean, my grandkids, you know, in the year 2100, they're going to be old guys like me. What will they be dealing with then? So that's what we have to consider now in our town and for our town.
I think that might be a great way to end it. I want to thank Emmeline and Dick and Laura and Becky so much. This has been a really informative and educational hour that we've spent together. I will send the recording to everyone and a brief survey. And you know, if you're interested in anything else that has to do with this subject or other subjects that relate to the town, let us know in a reply to that, and we're more than happy to start to continue this conversation. So thanks everyone so much for attending.
Thank you all.
Great. Thank you for hosting it, Phil.
You're welcome. Take care, everyone. Have a great
Bye-bye.
week. Bye-bye.
Bye.